Good afternoon. My Keystone takes the form of an honors thesis in sociocultural anthropology titled Who Sees Whom? Visibility Across Socioeconomic Classes in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'd like to start by thanking my thesis advisor, Professor Jeffrey Rubin, for his ongoing support. This is the outline to the sections of my thesis, and what is in red is what I will touch on today in this presentation. But my thesis deals with the question of visibility in an urban setting. Who interacts with who, what levels of visibility and subsequently understanding exist between members of different socioeconomic classes. And my use of the term visibility sometimes refers to surface-level seeing and short-term interactions, but the term is also used to evoke the idea of understanding, empathy, and comprehension across class divides. Now, every city has its own ecosystem, but my thesis research applies these questions to the city of Rio de Janeiro. So why Rio? Why is Rio a specifically interesting city to dissect and understand in terms of visibility? So my initial inspiration came from my own experience living and studying in Rio for 7 months of the last year. But while I was there, and as is made obvious in these images, perhaps the most clear obstruction to class visibility in Rio is the geographic and infrastructural layout of the city. So these are photos of the south zone of Rio, which is typically the wealthiest area of Rio. And as you can see, there's a contrast between the infrastructure of the hillsides, also called morros, which are home to the informally constructed neighborhoods called favelas, or shantytowns, and the ground level, which is often referred to as o asfalto, or the asphalt, because of the formal pavement and infrastructural planning. So one effect of this geographical division, in conjunction with the lack of jobs within favela communities themselves, is that favela dwellers are constantly moving between the hillside and the asphalt and the wealthier zones as they go to work. So they are seeing this contrast, while members of the middle and upper class very rarely are confronted with the realities of the lowest class neighborhoods, or the favelas. So my methodology consists of the use of a combination of academic sources and academic theory across different disciplines, as well combined with non-academic, culturally relevant material like movies, literature, performance art, and news articles. So I place these sources in conversation with each other to make connections and to try to read between the lines of what is being said and what is not being said, and by whom. So I look specifically for certain subgroups that inform or defy expectations about the reality of the lower class in Rio in relation to larger Rio society. The core of my thesis is my chapter titled The Obstruction, Obscurity, and Creation of Class Visibility. And this chapter looks at whose narratives are seen, heard, and told, and who is doing the telling. And how can these narratives be reframed or made more complete to better represent the realities of life in Rio as a member of a certain socioeconomic class. So beyond the narratives themselves, I explore commonly held societal beliefs and practices and how they differ between members of different socioeconomic classes and how this might affect cross-class interaction. One section of this chapter, titled Labor and Legitimacy, Whose Work Matters, discusses the prevalence of a form of wageless, informal labor, which are the trash collectors in Rio who work independently to collect recyclable materials that they exchange for daily pay per pound of material. And I also explore the history of Brazil's normalization of formal employment as an indicator of legitimate citizenship and informal or wageless labor as an indicator of criminality. So the surface level of visibility of trash collectors comes from the constant presence of these workers in Rio's public spaces. Many passersby might assume that what they are doing is work as a default, that it's not a choice, or it's a result of no other employment options, and that the work is unstructured and not really incorporated into the larger economy. However, there is a much fuller narrative here. These trash collectors are part of a larger recycling industry that actually plays a critical role in Brazil's economy, and many collectors are fully supporting entire families through this work. The bigger narrative also combats the belief that trash collecting as a job is a last resort, because In the ethnography and the documentaries that I used in this section, workers express that their job is actually how they mitigate the precarity that comes from living in the favela communities. So many of them are actively choosing to be doing the work that they are doing. So they choose this. It's an exercise of autonomy because of the flexibility and independence of their work schedule. They have daily pay, so they're getting income every single day, and they don't have a boss or any sort of higher-up hierarchy. So this fights the perception of informal labor as illegitimate and wageless workers as non-contributors, and it also calls attention to the exercise of agency and autonomy that informal employment allows. So another section of this chapter is titled Intimate Interactions, Empregada-Patrão Relationships. So the empregada means a domestic worker, domestic employee, and patrões are their employers and, by extension, the family of the immediate employer. And the hiring of a domestic worker in Rio and in broader Brazil society is central to the identity and the construction of a middle class. And there's even a construction of social prestige around not knowing how to do domestic work or manual labor. So I investigate how, despite being some of the most intimate and long-lasting cross-class relationships, how do these relationships reflect broader issues of class visibility? So the socially accepted narrative surrounding domestic work is that empregadas form really close, intimate relationships with their employers, who often see them as an extension of their own family or a part of their family. And also that the middle and upper classes believe that domestic work is a great employment opportunity in what is currently a job-sparse economy. These can be true, but there is a lot more under the surface. So the domestic work industry is deeply, deeply rooted in Brazil's original colonial economy, which was dependent on slave labor. And domestic workers in Rio are predominantly Afro-Brazilian women who are considered unfit for other types of employment as a result of racist and classist discrimination. There's also a lot of ambiguity in the establishment of professional and personal relationships between the employees and their bosses, and these boundaries create an emotionally precarious work environment. The internalized classist beliefs of both the empregadas and their employers also lead to many unwritten or unspoken rules of engagement between the employer and employee. So I ask, why do these rules exist? Where do they originate? And who is really creating them? And there is always an explicit imbalance of power in these relationships. Employers are able to maintain an out-of-sight, out-of-mind mindset towards their empregadas, while empregadas are constantly taking on excess emotional and physical labor as their employees define and redefine the relationships. So my thesis is meant to explore the current conditions of class visibility and identify where it is obstructed, where it is obscured, and where it can be created. But one takeaway is the intentionality behind obstructing class visibility through media misrepresentations of lower class narratives and through societal norms that advocate the idea that ignorance is bliss, especially when dealing with intense issues like violence, hunger, and extreme poverty. But there are platforms for the creation of visibility, and there are lots of examples of further opportunities for the assertion of visibility and the assertion of a lower class voice. The sources that I've been working with are often directly engaging the opinions and perspectives of members of the lower class in Rio. And there's many sources that are defying traditional narratives and stigmas. And another assertion of visibility is the collective action and union building around labor rights for informal labor as well as for domestic workers. So thank you for listening, and I hope you continue to think about who you interact with, where and why, and how class-based narratives have been consciously or unconsciously conveyed to you.
Any questions?
Thanks so much for your presentation.
Of course.
I want to zoom in on the way that the workers move from the mountains you showed us into the places where they work. I'm curious about the transit landscape in Rio, and sometimes transit is a place where we brush up against all of our neighbors regardless. So I'd love if you could speak to that a bit.
That's an excellent question. another section of my paper specifically talks about the infrastructure of transportation. So a lot of, not just in the South Zone, but in some of the other peripheral areas, the workers who are coming to work are taking 2 to 3 hour bus trips both ways. And so there's the immediate effect of it feeds in on their time. They also have home responsibilities. But as far as transportation as a point of class interaction, there's a very interesting documentary in a different section of my thesis that talks about an incident of hostage-taking on a bus, and it turns into a situation of what narrative is being communicated about the person who orchestrated that incident and everything like that. But there's also, on a more positive note, really interesting stories of people coming together and using the time on their bus routes to sort of build community and friendship. So, it works both ways. But yeah, transportation in Rio specifically is a really, really big issue.
So, great presentation. So during your time, in Rio, did you have any personal experiences with empregadas, depending on how you stayed, or was it with the host family, or so on and so forth?
So I was living in an apartment-style building, so no, I didn't have a domestic worker helping me, but I did meet people who grew up, being raised partially by domestic workers, and they speak so fondly of them, and then there's this disconnect where they no longer have contact with these people that essentially raised them. But no, my time in Rio, the most obvious observations that I made were actually more about the trash collectors. They were constantly around, constantly working, and it was a very surface level short-term interaction, and I was just curious about what people who grew up with that always around them were thinking about that.
Thanks for this presentation.
Sure.
Since you were looking at visibility, I'm interested in the use of visual media in your archive, the sort of films and performance art.
Yeah.
And were you seeing those artists or creators trying to sort of intervene on issues of visibility in their work also?
Yeah, so a lot of the sources I was looking at, whether they were, academic ethnographies that work to show a fuller truth, or they were just culturally relevant sources like films, they were made to combat a baseline narrative. So one of the films that informed the section on domestic workers is a film that portrays the moment where a domestic worker is sort of confronted with these unspoken rules and this internalized classism. So that is a theme of a lot of the visual art that I've looked at, yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Emily. It's great to learn more from you through this project. Can you say a little bit about what you think we kind of get through by thinking through visibility rather than through something like voice, for example?
Yeah, so the initial idea behind visibility really came from that very obvious geographic obstruction, but visibility can be more passive, right? And it's something that you can't deny whether a person sees or is interacting with, sees but doesn't really understand, versus whether they listen to. So I think that's part of the idea. But voice is part of the construction of narrative. It's not so much an issue of is there not enough voice out there, because it really is. It's just what is getting seen and heard, and how are people actively ignoring that. So the creation of visibility makes it so that you can't ignore it, right? It's in your line of sight or in your mind. Thank you.